finishing this book, I have been giddy to talk about it and throw it at people for the many months since I read it. So this is exciting. Come back and tell me what you think. There are a few things just to know about the garden, which is that because it is a slightly different space, feel free to move around. If you find that you are uncomfortable, we have extra cushions. We have benches. You can lean against a tree, sit on the floor, whatever you need to do. We will be signing here afterwards. There will be more cupcakes, an elderflower cordial, and stick around and get a book signed and ask any questions that you don't have a chance to ask. And I'm going to hand over to Carly to introduce the night and our wonderful author. Will you put your hands together to welcome our host, Carly?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What an incredible, lovely evening to be outside. I'm so glad that we get to all be here to celebrate the launch, the birthday of This Princess Kills Monsters by Herman. This is an incredible book written by a dear friend and a really, really wonderful author. So yes, my name is Carly Brown. Hello to yourselves. Hello to the virtual audience that we have out there too. So I'm very thrilled to be here to celebrate to celebrate the book, which for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, I know you're gonna love it. It's so smart, it's so funny, and it's a very transporting queer fantasy novel, which I feel like we can all use some transporting to some very fun mischief and mayhem and delights. So it's a wonderful book to read for now and forever. So a brief rundown. I'm going to introduce you to Ree, who will then read you an excerpt from the book, which I think is especially appropriate because it's a fairy tale book. So we're going to have a story time. So I think that's going to be particularly nice. And then I'm going to chat with them a little bit. And of course, there will be opportunities for yourselves, the audience, to ask questions after that. So please be thinking of your questions and what you might want to ask them, and then more cupcakes, more cordial, more partying. So for those who do not know Ree Herman has held a variety of jobs, including submissions editor, theatrical technician, and one position that could best be described as typing the number 5 all day long. I feel like that's a good question for later, maybe. They are bisexual and genderqueer. Their hobbies include weightlifting, playing tabletop role-play games, and reading as many books as humanly possible, which I feel like we can all get behind. For many years, Herman was primarily a playwright, and they've also worked as an actor and a director as well. They performed at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2018 and 2019.
In Jack Jackman's plays.
Oh, that's awesome. Amazing. And they were born in the US, but now permanent resident of Scotland. Yay, Scotland! Woo! That's Ree, and This Princess Kills Monsters, as I said, such a joy to read. Really excited to talk about it. If you love fairy tales, book for you. Lots of references, which I'm sure we'll talk about, to fairy tales famous that you might know about, and maybe a bit less famous that you haven't heard of. So it's a fun, adventurous, super delightful story. So I'm going to hand it over to Ree to tell you a little bit more about it and share some of it with you.
Thank you, Carly. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the garden of the absolute best bookstore in town. There are other great ones, but this is the best. So, a little bit about how this book got written and what it's about. So, it really started during the first pandemic lockdown, because I honestly thought lockdown, I'd be doing it on easy mode, because I'm a writer, I already work from home, I had my nice office set up, and I didn't think there would be any problems. And then a few months later, when I hadn't written anything, I was like, oh, right, yeah, creeping existential dread. I forgot about that. So I started reading fairy tales. Basically, go ahead, okay, they're inspirational, they're great. I'll see if anything leaps into my brain and demands that I write something about it. And I read all the normal ones, Snow White, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, and then I came across one called The 12 Huntsmen. And I'm going to give you the briefest possible summary of the story of The 12 Huntsmen. So a prince is engaged to a woman he loves deeply, but he gets word that his father is dying, so he has to run home. So he gives his lady love a ring and runs off to his father. And his father, the king's dying wish is that he marry this other princess, not the person he loves. The prince is like, well, crap. He decides he can't really go against his father's dying wish, so he becomes engaged to the other princess. Now, the first lady is very pissed off about this, so she hatches a completely incomprehensible plan, which is to gather 11 women who look exactly like her in every possible respect. Easy. Dress them all up as men, including herself, and then go off, and they present themselves to the prince, now king, and say, hey, employ us as huntsmen. And the king says, well, that's weird, but you men are also mysteriously sexy, that I'm gonna do it. Now, the problem arises because, as of course you already know, the king has a talking lion who knows all manner of secrets. No explanation for this is ever given in the story. And the lion says, hey, those huntsmen you have, they're women. And the king's like, nah. And the lion says, okay, I'll prove it. Scatter peas across the floor and then summon them. Because if they're women, they're gonna skip and hop about and prance, and they'll scatter the peas across, and if they're men, they're going to stomp the peas flat. But someone warns the women so that when they come in, they stomp and mash the peas flat. The king is like, you stupid lion. But then the lion says, oh, okay, one more chance. We'll put out a spinning wheel, and all women will absolutely be automatically drawn to this spinning wheel, because that's just how women are. So he puts it out, but someone warns the women, so they are careful to ignore the spinning wheel. And so the king is like, the lion's wrong, let's go on a hunt. So they go on a hunt, and as they're on a hunt, they get word that the princess, who is now engaged to the king, is arriving. So his lady love, disguised as a man, faints and falls off her horse. And as he rushes to comfort her and takes her gloves off, he recognizes the ring he gave her, which is the first time he realizes who this is. And says, oh, I can have no other love, I will marry you, tell that other princess to go home, the end. Now, you may think I have skipped some important parts of the story which make it make sense. I have not. That is the full and total plot, and I found myself obsessed with this. Just, what was her original plan? Why did she gather 11 identical duplicates? Why is there a gender essentialist talking lion? Did the king really not recognize the woman he knew and was engaged to because she put on a pair of trousers? What is going on? And I found myself most fascinated by the princess from the foreign country, whose entire role in the story is to show up and then immediately be sent home again without saying a single word. And I just found myself thinking, what did she make of all of this? What did she make of showing up into this country where she's supposed to marry this guy, and there's 12 identical duplicate huntsmen running around, and a talking lion who's putting out spinning wheels and telling people to walk across peas, and then the king is like, I didn't want to marry you after all. And so I wrote a book about her, and that's This Princess Kills Monsters. In doing so, I added in a lot of elements from a lot of other fairy tales, and filled in about 90,000 words worth of story to make the plot of the original make some semblance of sense. And I'll now read a short excerpt of it for you. Chapter 1, The Irritating Riddle of the Sphinxes. All sphinxes adore riddles and games. The best way to avoid losing any limbs is to correctly answer whatever they ask. But in this case, I was having a difficult time figuring out what the question was in the first place. So far, I'd managed to determine that one of them always lied, and one of them always told the truth, although I wasn't entirely certain which one was which, while the third one, for some reason, only recited nature poetry. I remembered there was a way to solve this kind of riddle, but I couldn't for the life of me recall what it was. "Will you answer this question with a lie?" I asked. "No," said the first Sphinx, grinning to reveal its pointed teeth. "No," the second Sphinx replied as well. "A lone fallen leaf floats across the placid pond. Autumn has arrived," said the third one. I'd been hoping one of the Sphinxes would say it was lying, get caught in a paradox, and, I don't know, explode maybe. The day was bright and clear, a crisp morning in early autumn that for once promised no rain. A lone cloud stretched across the sky, a thick white line with wisps reaching out from the center in straight, regular rows. It looked like the spine and ribs of some enormous skeleton suspended in midair. Behind the Sphinxes, a single row of trees topped the rise, their leaves just beginning to show the first hints of red and gold. And beyond, on the other side of the slope, spread a broad, flat field overrun by tall, yellowing grass, which made the Sphinxes a problem because I was supposed to plow that field and sow it with teeth. 1,000 teeth, to be precise. I had no idea why. My stepmother hadn't bothered to explain. She never did before sending me or my sisters off on one of her bizarre quests. But when the queen says go, you go. I had tried refusing once, and it wasn't an experience I cared to repeat anytime soon. I decided to get a start on the tedious process of gathering 1,000 teeth. After a few days spent dickering with dentists, I didn't have anywhere near enough, so I started going door to door. As it turns out, people exhibit a wide variety of reactions to being asked if they have any spare teeth, but none of them could be described as a delight. I had managed to obtain enough teeth for the plowing, although only because I'd had a lucky break the week before. In the middle of my tooth collecting rounds, I'd been accosted by a fairy who accused me of trying to muscle in on her turf. She'd been gathering children's teeth for centuries. In exchange, she left small coins under their pillows. An odd hobby, but the habits of fairies were often difficult to understand. For instance, my sister-in-law, Knoflugir, made necklaces out of the left ears of her enemies. I tried very hard not to be Knoflugir's enemy. When I explained my quest to the weird orthodontic fairy, she forgave my effrontery and took me down a road made of teeth and through a gate made of teeth to her mansion made of teeth so we could sit on her tooth couch and drink tea from a pair of enormous hollowed-out molars pulled from some young giant's mouth. She was eager to offload her surplus, honestly. But even so, she refused to let me have any at all unless we made some kind of trade. Some further chat revealed that she was almost out of underpillow coins. She didn't earn any income apart from teeth, which made me question her business model. I went out to fetch some money for her and came across a cave where a troll was hoarding an enormous pile of small change. He was primed to eat me until I mentioned I was willing to strike a deal for cash, and he revealed that he was a collector of rare manuscripts with a desperate desire for first editions. It ended up turning into a whole thing. And by the end, I had traded the jewels of a princess, my earrings, since I am a princess technically, for a fiddle that played itself, for a goat with a golden fleece, for a musty pile of handwritten pages, for a sack full of coins, for a whole lot of teeth. As an added bonus, the fairy directed me to the field where the teeth needed to be sewn, for she was an expert on all matters dental.
That was great. Sorry, I was just lost in the story. Incredible. So you can see how it's such a delight to read. I was wondering if we could get started with actually what you were saying before about how during the pandemic you were kind of like drawn to fairy tales in general, and I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about why fairy tales, like what kind of brought you to those, and then if there was anything, you already kind of told us a little bit about what brought you to the Huntsman and its delicious idiosyncrasies, but tell us a little bit more about how you came to fairy tales because I know your previous books were quite different.
Yes. Well, I do love fairy tales, and they're some of the oldest stories on Earth, the folk tales they're based on. There's a fairy tale called The Smith and the Devil, which is thought to be about 6,000 years old. Cinderella is thousands of years old, and there are versions of it from Europe all the way to China. And yes, the Chinese version, although it's very different, does include the whole foot measuring thing. So it's very obviously the same story. I like how wild they are because in some ways, unlike modern books, they don't feel the need to explain themselves. As with the Talking Lion, if someone can turn into a lake, they just turn into a lake. There's no deep explanation of the whole process of learning and magic that led them to that point. It's just something they can do. If someone's heart is in a box, their heart is in a box. They're walking around, their heart's in a box, it's a thing. And because of that, they're really readily adaptable to all sorts of stories. And you can see that in just how they've changed over the years. There's so many different versions. The most familiar ones to modern audiences, English-speaking audiences, tend to be the Grimm Brothers 19th century German versions, or the 17th, 18th, and 19th century French versions, from which a lot of our fairy tales come. But there are hundreds of differing versions from all sorts of countries where the customs change and therefore the story changes, where the monster changes. In one place it's a witch, in one place it's a god, in one place it's an ogre, in one place it's a Kulshedra. And so that adaptability while maintaining these sort of basic human elements of story really draw me to them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it also, as you were talking about it, I really liked how in your author's note you acknowledge as well the like the oral history of like the Grimm's stories, like all women that they were just like talking to, I guess, and like getting those tales from. And it made me think of one of my favorite aspects of your book, which is that people are always like telling each other stories in this book. So we have our main story, but then we also have a lot of like stories within stories. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit about that in terms of like, did you always know it was gonna be like this nesting doll of like stories within stories, or?
I didn't know that right away. It is something I like to do, but I started out thinking that this was going to be a fairly straightforward narrative without the nesting doll, matryoshka story elements. But it became, as I was writing it, in some ways, a story about storytelling, a story about the stories people tell to each other and how they change. And I'm like, well, then I got to have some storytelling in it. I have to have the characters tell a story. And as I worked on that, I realized, now that is a really convenient way to get into some backstory for these characters too. So, win-win.
That's very clever. That's so true. It's like a lot of times that's how we're learning the backstories of these characters. It's a good tip. Although it would be hard to apply to other stories because you do it so well and it's so like unique to this book. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I also like that through that I feel like we get a lot of different references to a lot of different stories, because like you said, you kind of start with 12 Huntsmen, but then we branch off into all of these different little, like, not side quests, but like kind of, like familiar stories keep cropping up as you're reading it, like ones that I think when you read it you'll recognize, but then I feel like there were loads of references that probably went straight over my head that I didn't know. Like I caught one, although I'm not sure it was directly referenced, like maybe Bluebeard.
Definitely.
Be bold, but not too bold. Is that from Bluebeard? What is
That's
that?
from Mr. Fox,
That's from Mr. Fox.
which is a very Bluebeard-like British story.
It is. I hadn't made that connection. See, there's all these little like bits and pieces in it, and I guess I was wondering, did you, as you were weaving in all of these, were there some that you like really wanted to include, but then you were like, this doesn't really work for this one, or were there ones that you were like, I really think that this would be like a perfect? How did it how did all those come together in the tapestry
Well,
that they are?
when I was writing it, what I generally discovered is the more obscure the story was, the more explanation it required to be in the book. Like, if I made a reference to The Little Mermaid, there's a brief reference to The Little Mermaid, I was pretty confident everyone was going to get it. But if I made a reference to how six made their way through the world, yeah, that requires some unpacking, because unless you're a student of fairy tales, you're much less likely to remember that one. So some of the fairy tales, like the 12 Huntsmen, were adapted for use in the story. So how six men got out in the world. Even if you don't know the story, reading the book, you're like, oh, okay, that's that story. That's what's going on there. But if there was just a passing reference, I tried to make it a more well-known story, and I didn't always succeed, because there were some I just couldn't resist, because there's a story about a donkey that poops gold, and I couldn't find a larger place for it in the book, but I really wanted to mention it, so that's in there, because how can you not?
It had to be. You couldn't, yeah, you had to, absolutely. I feel like another aspect that I really liked about it that you were talking about in your intro is like that the main characters in this aren't like the main characters in the Huntsman story. So here we have our princess is not it's kind of like you're coming at it from like the side or something like that. Literally, it's like side characters become our like main characters. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about how like I feel like that also links with kind of the queer romance aspect of it, because I feel like this is like centering characters and like love stories that might be maybe more implicit or even not there or implicitly there in the originals. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit more about like the queer elements of the story with its beautiful rainbow cover, or alternatively maybe also like the side character aspect of it, that this is like kind of, I don't know, like we're seeing from a different angle, so to speak. Yeah.
Sure, why not both?
Why not both?
So there's definitely queer subtext in the original story, in the sort of Shakespearean manner of, oh, it is a girl dressed as a boy that I, a man, am curiously attracted to, but thank goodness everything's fine in the end, nothing queer to see here. There are a lot of fairy tales with that kind of queer subtext, some even much more. As I was working on the book that came after this, I found some stories where, yeah, there's a Spanish fairy tale where a pair of women just lived together as a married couple for years. There's a lot of fairy tales with a lot of trans subtext, often approaching text. And yeah, I did find that looking at the minor characters was a way to get that in a more textual way, because I wanted to have, the big main romance of the original, the prince and his disguised lady, but they're background characters in this story. So that gave me a chance to say, okay, what's going on with the other characters? What's going on with this princess? What's going on with these other 11 huntsmen? Were there any of them who were like, oh, yeah, I really like dressing as a man. This is great, for whatever reason. And it let me, since she is from a foreign country, not the basic country, it let me say, okay, are the customs different elsewhere? So there ended up being kind of a queer norm country. And she goes to, this much more sort of European fairy tale country and is like, ugh, these guys are pretty backward. And yeah, and seeing how things evolve for that, and how encounters with other countries can change attitudes that way. And yeah, it gave me a lot of space to explore, because I didn't have to stick to the confines of the original story.
But as you said, those are still like there. Like we do still have the kind of the structure of the quote unquote original sort of story, but then we're like coming at it from a different lens, which it sounds like gave you just like a lot of fun space to like play than if you had to I don't know, if you were trying to take just the original and like just focus on that, it gave you a way to kind of, I don't know, yeah, come at it from a different perspective, which is super cool.
And I got to put in all kinds of queer relationships because I wanted to.
Yeah, you're the author. Yes, absolutely. Actually, well, I was going to ask a little bit later, but do you want to talk about the other book that is coming out set in the same world, universe, fantasy?
Very briefly, I will.
Okay.
So, for the book that comes after this, I was going through a similar process of what to write next. And I actually came across not just a single fairy tale, but a whole set of related fairy tales, because they change from country to country, which are where the queer subtext is much closer to being text. It's really right below the surface. It's a set of fairy tales about women who dress as men, but then end up getting transformed into men. So I wanted to explore that, and what I ended up doing is picking a very, very minor character from this book and making them the main character of that book. And so that character is non-binary and has elements of their journey to non-binarity are taken from my life, and also look at, other things. And it's also based on a really long, rollicking adventure fairy tale, so I got to sort of have very knightly things happen, so that was a lot of fun too.
And I've read a draft of it. It's amazing. It is a very knightly adventure. It was wonderful. One of the, I have an association with fairy tales. I don't know, you can tell me if this is actually true, that they have an instructive quality to them, or that it's don't go in the woods, little girls, you don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know if that's actually true, A, and B, if it is true, did that inspire any aspect of your writing process, in the sense of were you thinking about I think maybe moral is too strong a word, but were you thinking of a message or a kind of thing that you wanted people to take from it?
That is definitely an aspect of many fairy tales. A lot of them are follow the cultural norms or you will be devoured by witches. But I wouldn't say I put a moral or morals per se in the book. I did want to explore themes, but that's not quite the same thing. And I think in some ways that's the difference between a book and a story. Because a story, they're very short. The story this is based on is about 4 pages long. So it can be very self-contained. It can be intended to have a single message, as baffling as that message might be. But a book, it needs to fit. The characters need to have more depth. They need to have a bit more nuance to them than, oh no, I have strayed from the path. Oh no, wolves. Although that is actually something that happens in the book. But it's a small part of the book instead of being the entire book. Just because, it needs to be fleshed out. It needs to be a story about real people. And morals tend to be more stories about allegorical figures.
That makes complete sense. And also when you're dealing with people and their lives, it's what are the the morals just of living that. I'm so glad I asked that. That's a really interesting. Yeah, I can totally see that. I'm wondering, so we start thinking, folks, if you want to ask anything as well, but maybe I'll sneak in 1 or 2 more questions before then, so you can start thinking. I was just wondering, basically, what your favorite character was to write in this book, because I asked that because so many of the characters were so quirky and delightful, and I was wondering what which one stands out to you and which one you enjoyed writing the most or didn't enjoy writing the most. I don't know.
I have to say, so there are many characters I loved writing in this book for a variety of reasons. It was a delight to make the talking lion just so awful. But
Very smarmy, that lion.
yes. But I have to admit, my favorite character to write is the main character's sister-in-law, the fairy Knofligir, who is, so as was mentioned in the excerpt, you know, the one who keeps necklaces of left ears of her enemies. Yeah, she's very, I'm going to say, forthright.
Yes, that is absolutely accurate. Yes, yeah.
She likes to.
Yeah.
Her solution to most problems is to attack people with a sword or light things on fire. And,
Set it on fire. That's
yes.
That's her deal. Yeah.
And you know, good for her.
I think she was my favorite character to read, actually, because of the simplicity of those solutions. She'd just be like, they'd all be brainstorming what the plan was, and she's like, I think the plan is like we light it on fire. And I was like, yeah, I hear you, girl. It's yeah. I really, really loved reading her. But I liked our narrator as well. I like Melilot, right? Yeah.
Melilot, yes.
Yeah, Melilot. I think that I really enjoyed her narration too, but I also, have to love the kind of smarmy, gender-obsessed lion as well. Why is he so obsessed with maintaining the humans' gender norms that he questions all the women?
Well, I do love writing Melilot. I mean, I had to since she narrates the whole story, so I'm with her a lot. But yeah, I love her sense of humor. She's kind of sassy.
She is sassy, and you know, I think another element of the book that I really enjoyed, which is kind of, I think it goes along with this like side character thing, is like she has these two really epic sisters. She's very, is she the middle child?
Yes.
Yes. So that's kind of, I feel like that's a big thing in this, where she's like kind of having to prove herself and get out there and write her own story, so to speak. Yeah, absolutely. I think it might be audience time.
Works for me.
If you would like to jump in with any questions, I have some more questions, but please feel free to ask your questions now to Ree, and we can continue our fairy tale chat. This is the most incredible question. Do you want to summarize it for the audience at home, or
Okay.
That was an amazing question.
So the question is, because her daughter is obsessed with fairies, where do fairies live and what do they do there? In my opinion, in these books. So there is some mention of that in these books. I may get into that in a lot more detail in book 3, if it ever exists, because I'm thinking about possibly writing a book about Knofligir, her fairy sister-in-law,
Please do this.
in
Yes.
which they go back to her home. So in the books, it's mentioned that they live in a place called the Summerlands. It's mentioned that they're sort of alien to humans, that they look at human sort of logic and reason and go, why? What? Ugh. And it's mentioned that they steal children and replace them with exact duplicates for reasons they are apparently kind of embarrassed about, and this nearly causes a war. But then there's a treaty which also included regulated the trade in hen's teeth and similar things, but it's not a big part of this particular book. The next book, which is being worked on right now, goes into a little more about wish-granting fairies, the ones that appear at children's birth or naming day and say, "I will give you the blessing of something or other." There's a lot of that about that in the next book, but if I get into that in great detail, I think it would be in the 3rd book. But if you want some authors who have some really interesting ideas of that, I would recommend Holly Black. who is an author of young adult sort of urban fairy stories that I really like a lot. Let's see, who else does good fairies?
Oh, do you like Ella Enchanted? I loved Ella Enchanted when I was a kid.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's really good.
Um,
Some really kind of fairy disastrous fairy decisions in that one.
yeah, but Holly Black, and if I think of any more, I'll let you know before we leave. Oh, yes, absolutely. Frances Hardinge, her book Cuckoo Song, it's amazing.
That was an amazing question. Thank you.
There are a couple of lines, so while you guys are thinking.
Brilliant.
I devoured the book in 2 days. I love how funny and irreverent the day was. Did you get any pushback from the publisher or yourself in how much queer is it being queer? What relationships did you feel? How many fairy tales do you want to come from? It's deliciously
So that's a question about, did I get any pushback from myself or my publisher about how gay this book could be? And no, actually. The queerness, I think, was, I think one of the things that drew my editor to it, because I've now read other books that she's edited, and they are all super queer. So, you know, if anything, my publisher was like, make it gayer. So, and I'm like, I'm here for that. And what was the end of the question?
How many fairy tales you could include?
Everyone I could find that I could fit in went in, because they're all just so weird.
I like the description of the book as extra as well. That's yeah. Nice.
Okay, so that's what genre would I define this as being? And do I
particular
like
tropes.
do I like particular tropes? And what would I define this as being? So, you know, it's definitely fantasy. I would put it in the subgenre of fairy tale retelling. I probably would not call it, strictly speaking, romantasy, although there's a lot of romance elements, so I might call it romantasy adjacent. But I think the central plot is really the adventure story. So I'd say queer adventure fantasy with a strong romance element. As for tropes, I like lots of tropes. I mean, there's obviously tropes in this one. There's a scene where I very much lampshade, and there was only one bed.
Love that part.
If
yeah.
you're familiar with that one. And fairy tales are full of tropes because, you know, like myths, they're among the oldest stories we have. So a lot of the whole idea of what stories are come down from them. So while there are certainly a lot of tropes that ended up in this book, I mean, it's hard for me to say which ones are my favorite because, like I said like Carly said in the introduction, I love reading everything. So if an author makes a trope work, I'm like, yes, I will read this. So pretty much I'm here for all of them. I know that's a lame answer, like, what kind of music do you like? All kinds of music, it's terrible. But that's how I feel about it, so I don't know what else to say.
If from a reader's perspective, if I could just say in terms of genre, maybe comedy too. I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
It's very funny. It's really funny.
Okay, so let's make that comic, fantasy, adventure, fairy tale retelling, romantasy adjacent. And cozy.
Oh, it's very cozy as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, a lot of folklore that we sort of you've already mentioned some of those sort of fairy stories for replacing children, etc. How did you find sort of navigating and maintaining a sort of whimsical comedic side to that?
Okay, so that question was, a lot of fairy tales are very, very dark, and things like the fae stealing children has always been mentioned. How did I maintain keeping it on the whimsical side of that? And yeah, there are some really dark elements of fairy tales. I mean, honestly, the Grimm Brothers versions, which a lot of people think, oh, they're so dark compared to the stories we tell children nowadays, those were seriously cleaned up for what came before. And admittedly, you know, a lot of what they cleaned up was they took out a lot of the sex, and they took out a lot of, I'm going to say, scatological elements. But there were some things that, you know, there was some violence. They were like, oh, this is too far. One thing that I was particularly interested in is they invented the evil stepmother, because in the original stories, those were mothers who were sending those children off to the woods to starve to death and die. And the Grimm brothers were like, no, that's too rough. No, that's not her kid. That's a stepmother. Yeah, we'll say that. So yeah, these dark elements definitely exist, and people have been, there are versions where people dance around them for years, because, you know, these are tales that adapt, as I said, to what the culture of the time is. And there are times and places when children's stories can be very violent and awful, and times when people are like, no, not for kids. For this one, even though it's not a children's story, I wanted to keep it, you know, comic and whimsical. And part of that is, even if the most awful things in fairy tales are referenced, because I wanted to, you know, make mention of them, they're referenced in the sort of, you know, humorous way. Like, oh, they're gonna kill me? Are they gonna make me dance in hot iron shoes or throw me in a barrel of poison snakes? Which? So keeping it on the light side rather than showing, you know, anything. Most of the truly horrific things, if they happen off the page. There's some stories about things which the villain did to some previous characters, which are, you know, if they were on the page, would not be out of place in a horror story. So it is a challenge, sort of keeping it, okay, what's the line to keep this a comedy, but acknowledge that, yeah, fairy tales get dark, and it's something I had to try and toe that very narrow path. So yeah.
Yes.
So this is a super interesting question about the origins of the 12 Huntsmen story. Did it maybe have some different stories mashed together effectively to create this story, do you think?
Very likely it did. Very likely there were stories mashed together, and very likely there were original parts which just got lost along the way. Possibly the parts that, you know, explained what the whole 12 identical duplicate thing was about, and where the line came from and all that. So I've recently been reading the ATU Index of Fairy Tales, which is just a list of like all the fairy tale tropes, basic stories, and all their variations. And if you look at them, you'll get like, you know, tale type this, you know, this is a story where someone goes on a quest for her husband who has been captured by monsters. But there'll be notes which says this story is often combined with this other kind of story, or this other kind of story, or this other kind of story, because they didn't just change, they got mixed and matched. I mean, this is an oral tradition. So if someone was telling like Little Red Riding Hood and thought, you know, I want pirates. I want a pirate attack in this story. They could just throw one in and there'd be a whole sequence, you know, taken from some other story, or even invented wholesale with which is Little Red Riding Hood and the Pirates. And you may think that doesn't sound like something that would happen, but believe me, it can get that weird. And so for the 12 Huntsmen, so the gender tests that the lion sets is actually a form of story, but they're not always set by a lion. So it feels kind of like the gender test story got mashed together with the talking animal story, and somewhere along the line, why there is a talking animal got, oh, we don't need to talk about that. There's a talking animal that sets gender tests. What more do you need to know? And yeah, so, and then there's sort of the quest for the, it's called the Forgotten Fiancé story, where someone is ditched by their fiancé and goes to win them back. And so that got mixed up with these other two stories. And yeah, as these got mashed together and remixed, parts were added and parts were lost. And that is one reason why the story ended up so very odd. She asked, is it odd that there's only two gender tests instead of three, since three is such an important number for fairy tales? Yeah, probably in most other stories I read that have gender tests, there were three. So yeah, they probably just booted one out. We need to make more room for the talking animal, clearly. So, so the flower gender test, which is a gender test that comes up in stories like, now, do you want this? Are you really a man or a woman in disguise? Do you want this rose or do you want this battle axe? They are that stupid. So yeah, there was probably a third one of those which got booted aside. So the question is, am I naturally whimsical, or did I have to really work at it to be whimsical as a writer, since there's so much pressure to be serious? I do think comedy comes more naturally to me than tragedy. I have written one tragedy in my life, and the only way I could do it was at the end, constantly repeating to myself, these characters are all going to be okay 5 years later. Even the dead ones are going to be fine. It's going to be fine. I just won't write that part. I'll stop here where it looks terrible. Because just I end up caring deeply about my characters. I know there are some people in this audience who, for example, write horror. And I'm not saying I would never do that, but I think that would be more outside my comfort zone than whimsy. I do like drama. I love family drama. I love, epic feats and adventure. I love all, you put your characters in danger because that's what makes a story. You give your characters problems because that makes a story. But I think I am most drawn to whimsy. So the question is, does my life go into the story, or has my life changed as the book is being written?
Cool question.
Yeah, that is it. For this book, some, because as I mentioned before, this was a book I wrote starting during the pandemic lockdowns. And I think there's two kinds of pandemic books. There's ones which I have read and loved, which are deeply grim, dystopian, here we all locked together in a bunker, or the zombies are attacking, or the world is at an end. And there are some great ones. And there are the ones which went, I'm gonna write some fun fairy tale whimsy. And I went that way very much. And so, yeah, I mean, in some ways, as I kept writing this and working on it, I think it was, a source of joy for me in a dark time. And I did have some issues with depression and anxiety during the pandemic, as a lot of people did. And I think, there were a lot of ways I worked on that, but I do think writing this book was one of many. And as for whether I have put myself in any of the books, for far more so than this one, my book, Love Bites, is, for a book about a vampire falling in love with a witch, is surprisingly about my life. There's a lot of me in there.
As a connoisseur of fairy tales, what is your favorite fairy tale?
Favorite fairy tale creature is the question.
Wow, that's hard. Give me a second, because there's so many fun ones, and they differ so much. Like recently online, I saw a little like meme post about how stories differ from culture to culture. And it was like, this is a troll, and it showed the horrible Dungeons and Dragons monster. This is also a troll, and it showed the Norwegian big hair hi that they're making animated movies about now. So in some ways, they're all very flexible as to how they appear. But I love people who are transformed into animals. I love a good frog prince or swan maiden or what have you, selkies, or animals that transform into people. Those, I'm really fond of all stories about that. I love fairies per se, which can get very interesting in actual fairy tales because, they can be anything from whimsical, helpful creatures to we will swallow your soul. I love, so in the ATU index, that index of fairy tales, the single largest section, there is a whole, thousands of different tales called Tricking the Stupid Ogre, which is about, clever like tailors or children, being an ogre is threatened to eat them, and they're like, oh, but whatever. And those are great. So, fond of those.
So the question is if this book is the first that uses the 12 Huntsmen, elements of the 12 Huntsmen.
I actually do not know. I have never seen or heard of any other book based on this particular fairy tale. That doesn't mean there's none. There's tons of books and tons of people who have the same ideas, but this fairy tale is on the obscure side as they go. So it is possible. I read a lot of fairy tale retellings, and I haven't encountered this particular one. So maybe.
Do you want to? Yeah.
They're not Narnia particularly, but there are definitely elements from other books I've drawn. And it's interesting that you talk about Penelope and her 12 servants, because if you look, a lot of these fairy tales can be directly traced to Greek myths. It is a strong connection. Like Cupid and Psyche there's a direct line between that and stories like Beauty and the Beast or Prince Hat Underground. And a whole bunch of others. You read fairy tales and Greek myths and go, oh, that's really the same story. So yeah, I would be surprised if the sort of trope of the 12 maidens is something that comes directly from Greece. In terms of other books, there's a couple ways. So there are some fairy tales which are literary fairy tales. Like The Little Mermaid is not originally a folk tale. It was an original story written by Hans Christian Andersen. So he came up with the whole concept himself. So there's references to literary fairy tales like The Little Mermaid and other stories in the book. And not in this book, but in the next one she was talking about, there's a lot of reference to Oz. So I take a lot of elements from those books. So that is definitely something I look to, because yeah, all these stories. I mean, Oz has been called an attempt to write an American fairy tale. It doesn't have to.
Amazing. I think that might be us in terms of time. So I just want to say thank you so much for all of the wonderful questions, both here and to the virtual audience, and also to Amazing Lighthouse for hosting us for like the most beautiful garden party ever. I'm just gonna say ever. And also congratulations once again to Ree on your absolutely amazing book. Please read it, you will love it. So once again, can we get a round of applause for Ree Herman?
Thanks, everyone. Let's party, have more cupcakes,
Woo!
drink cordial. I'll sign books if you want. Yay!